The countries of the BRICS group and other countries of the South have expressed growing dissatisfaction with the United States. These nations cite several key issues, among which is the undue influence that Western nations exert on international organizations and decision-making bodies. They argue that the current structure of the UN does not adequately reflect their interest or perspectives, calling for a more democratic society and an inclusive approach. At a recent summit, the leaders stressed the need for comprehensive reforms within the UN, stressing the importance of strengthening the participation of emerging countries. At the heart of their demands is a reassessment of the composition of the Security Council and a reconsideration of the right of veto held by its permanent members. This discontent has led to numerous calls for important reforms, or even a complete overhaul of the UN, with the aim of establishing a system of fair and representative representation of global governance. In this video, we will explore these proposed changes and the motivations behind them. The problems related to Western bias and double standards are particularly perceived by the BRICS countries. They see a significant bias in the United Nations and other international organizations which favor Western countries. This bias is particularly evident in human rights issues, where BRICS members such as China and Russia are often the subject of criticism, while similar problems in Western countries receive comparatively less scrutiny. For example, Russia regularly faces condemnation for its human rights record, including its treatment of the LGBTQ+ community, and China for its actions against Tibetan human rights defenders. Yet comparable concerns in the West often escape the same level of attention on international platforms. A striking example of this double standard is seen in the treatment of refugees. European nations have been particularly generous in their support for Ukrainian refugees, providing substantial resources and assistance. However, refugees from other conflict zones such as Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia have encountered more difficult conditions and considerably less support from these same European countries. Similarly, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, international responses often seem unbalanced. Governments quickly condemned Hamas's attacks on Israeli civilians, but criticism was relatively moderate regarding Israel's harsh retaliatory measures in Gaza, which included the cutting off of essential supplies and the use of white phosphorus in densely populated areas, resulting in significant civilian casualties and considered war crimes. Organizations such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have highlighted these disparities in representation and influence. The BRICS countries argue that global trade governance frameworks, including the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, are disproportionately dominated by Western powers and fail to adequately represent the interests of emerging economies and developing countries. These nations argue that their growing economic influence and geopolitical importance are not sufficiently recognized in these institutions. The governance structures and policies of the BRICS bloc emphasize that these institutions often reflect a post-World War II power structure that no longer reflects the current global economic landscape. For example, the leaders of the IMF and the World Bank have traditionally been held by individuals from Europe and the United States, perpetuating Western dominance in global economic and financial decision-making. The development concerns of many southern countries, including those of the BRICS group, believe that Western institutions impose strict conditions on financial assistance and development assistance that can compromise their economic growth and their sovereignty. They argue that these conditions are often prioritized for Western economic and political interests rather than to address the real development needs of the beneficiary countries. For example, these institutions frequently apply austerity measures and economic recovery policies that emphasize debt repayment and budgetary discipline to the detriment of social and economic development. This approach has been widely criticized for reducing public spending on essential services such as health and education, ultimately hindering the sustainability of development. Geopolitical rivalries, especially those involving Russia and China, have intensified these concerns. Actions such as sanctions and political measures are often perceived as an effort to limit the influence of the BRICS nations on the world stage, further deepening dissatisfaction with international institutions such as the United Nations. China, for example, faces considerable challenges with Western nations regarding its policies in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and sanctions in the South China Sea, as well as other punitive measures imposed by the United States and the European Union. These attempts to curb China's growth as a leading economic and geopolitical power have led to increased tensions and a sense of being targeted by the current international and Western order. Geopolitical alliances such as the Quad, United States, India, Japan, Australia, and the AUKUS, Australia, United States, United Kingdom, are perceived by the BRICS countries as attempts to contain their growing influence, reinforcing their feeling of marginalization in the international system. The BRICS countries criticize the distribution of voting power at the IMF, which is considered biased in favor of Western countries, in particular the United States. They believe that this distribution does not reflect the current economic landscape, where emerging economies such as China play a key role. On global climate policies, the BRICS countries point out that they are often dictated by Western nations without sufficiently taking into account the development needs of emerging economies. They are calling for financial and technological support for a green transition without slowing down their growth. The COVID-19 pandemic has revealed the shortcomings of global governance, with the BRICS countries criticizing the WO for a response they consider biased, with an unfair distribution of vaccines favoring rich nations. The BRICS countries believe that current global trade policies favor Western countries, citing problems such as agricultural subsidies in the United States and Europe, which, according to them, distort world markets and disadvantage farmers in developing countries. The UN, founded in 1945 after the Second World War, aims to maintain international peace and security, to promote human rights, and to encourage social and economic development. The organization was created by 51 countries on October 24, 1945, on the basis of the Charter of the United Nations, which established 6 main bodies: the General Assembly, the Security Council, the International Court of Justice, the Secretariat, the Economic and Social Council, and the Trusteeship Council. During the Cold War, from 1950 to 1989, the UN became an ideological battlefield between the Western and Eastern blocs, led respectively by the United States and the Soviet Union. Despite these tensions, the UN has played a crucial role in peacekeeping missions and decolonization efforts. In 1948, she oversaw her first peacekeeping mission in the Middle East, and the General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. After the Cold War, from 1990 to 2000, the United Nations faced new challenges and opportunities. The organization has become more active in peacekeeping and humanitarian efforts, especially in the Balkans, Rwanda, and Somalia. The 1990s marked an increase in UN peacekeeping missions, but also an introspection after the failure to prevent genocide in Rwanda, leading to reforms. The UN has also strengthened its role in sustainable development and global environmental issues with landmark events such as the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, which led to the creation of the UNFCCC and the Convention on Biological Diversity. In the 21st century, the UN adopted the Millennium Declaration in 2000, establishing the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, for 2015, focused on poverty reduction, health, education, and environmental sustainability. These MDGs then evolved into the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, in 2015, with 17 goals to be achieved by 2030. Proposals for UN reform have emerged, suggesting, for example, an expansion of the Security Council to include countries such as India, Brazil, and South Africa. These MDGs then evolved into the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, in 2015, with 17 goals to be achieved by 2030. Proposals for UN reform have emerged, suggesting, for example, an expansion of the Security Council to include countries such as India, Brazil, and South Africa. Other proposals call for strengthening regional organizations such as the African Union and ASEAN, in order to allow them to play a more significant role in global governance. Among the ideas for reforming global governance, the creation of democratic nations with a bicameral legislative system is notable. This concept aims to represent countries according to the size of their population, and to improve the democratic legitimacy of global structures. A World Parliamentary Assembly has also been proposed, supported by entities such as the European Parliament, to initially act as an advisory body to the UN General Assembly, with the potential to become a more powerful legislative entity. Recent surveys show significant public support for a global parliament that directly represents citizens rather than national governments. However, the challenges for the implementation of these ideas remain significant, requiring consensus among the UN member states and overcoming the resistance of powerful countries with veto rights. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching this video. We sincerely thank you for joining us today. If our content resonated with you or inspired you, please consider expressing your support by liking it and subscribing to stay connected with our community. Your support is of immense value to us. You can watch another video from our channel, which is now on the screen.